This has not been an easy year to be a migrant in Europe, witnessing how anti-migration sentiment has been weaponized for electoral gains, dominating national and EU elections, leading to far-right gains and even sparking actual riots against migrants. With far-right parties gaining ground at various levels of government and the European Parliament that's more right-wing than ever, the political landscape is becoming increasingly hostile to migrants. In this kind of a political climate, what's happening to migrants' political and civic participation? And what avenues remain for migrants to mobilize and engage in politics? Welcome to Changing the Table, where we uncover the obstacles faced by new Europeans in society and politics. I'm your host and producer Seden Anlar, and on this podcast, we're not only examining how migrants can be empowered to take a seat at the decision-making table, but we're also deconstructing harmful narratives about migrants to change the table itself. While it's not clear yet what exactly the European Commission is going to look like for the next 5 years, what is becoming clear day by day is that the EU stance on migration policy is going to be more harsh in the new mandate. And a similar picture can be seen all across Europe, especially where the far right is in powerful positions. To explore what this means for migrants and new Europeans' lives and political and civic participation in Europe, I'm joined by Dr. Anna Lenkowitz-Salminen, the coordinator of Nice Hearts, an organization based in Finland that empowers girls, women, and families to find their own place in society as its equal and unique members. I'm also joined by Kim Smouter, director of European Network Against Racism, a Brussels-based pan-European anti-racism network that combines advocacy for racial equality and cooperation among civil society actors. Take a listen. Anna, Kim, welcome. Thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Kim, maybe I can start with you. According to a new report by Hope Not Hate, 46% of people in the UK believe Muslims cause problems in the UK, 3 times higher than for other religious minorities, and that attitudes toward immigration and multiculturalism are shaped by views on Muslims more than any other minority group. This is obviously one of the many, many awful news stories that we hear and we see about migrants, migration, racialized and marginalized people in Europe these days. So there is a general sense of fear, frustration within migrant communities at the moment. In this kind of a hostile environment, how can migrants mobilize and participate in politics?
Thanks, Eden, for the question. A very important question, especially at a time, I think, when what we would call racialized communities, I think, are feeling a number of effects, So there's the kind of the concern, indeed, of even being able to exercise their right to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. And we've seen in a number of countries that right is being infringed or certainly being limited or being curtailed under the ethos that somehow the values espoused are anti-European. And I think that entire discourse is very demeaning and very disempowering for communities which in general have been at the margins of political life. And I think this creates this kind of this fear, this concern. It also, for many communities, this feeling that they're not being heard, that their voice is not important, that they're second-class citizens and those types of things, which I think contributes also to this feeling of disconnection between peoples that are important and are part of the European project.
Mm-hmm. So what do we do about that?
First and foremost, one of the important aspects is to ensure that racialized communities in general have access to the political level. How do we encourage more candidates? How do we encourage that the candidates are placed sufficiently high on political lists that they're actually electable? Because I think what we often see on political lists is that when it comes to racialized candidates, what happens is that they're being placed very low in the political field. So it's great from an optics perspective, but in reality, the chances of these people with these lived experiences reaching the political level are quite low. And you see that in the latest European elections, where It's only 3, 4% of MEPs are actually racialized, despite the fact that we're much more in the population. We see that not just at the European level, but it's also translated at the national level as well, and at the local and regional level too.
And that's on the electoral level. How about when it comes to mobilization and organizing at the community level?
So we at ENAR, we represent over 170 such community groups which work at a local level to combat racism, and I think they are also an important part of the conversation. So communities like civil society organizations are absolutely critical. First, to encourage and to motivate political action, to act as an advocacy group, and also for those who don't feel comfortable to participate in the structured political framework, then at least there is a secondary framework through civil society organizations, which can also have an influence and an input in the conversation. So I think that's another element which is really important. And then I would say the third one, and I think this is something which is perhaps needs to be emphasized even more than ever, is also the role that kind of youth organizations, trade unions, and other bodies can play also in activating the political fiber amongst young people, and also to encourage them to continue to participate in the political life, even if sometimes it seems like it doesn't make any sense to do so. And I think the empty chair problem becomes even more of a challenge in circumstances when actually racialized communities are being scapegoated for things that they have absolutely zero control over and also don't contribute anything about. And I think that's something which politicians are absolutely great at, is really encouraging this idea that somehow it's the racialized, it's the migrants, it's the new Europeans who are the cause of the problem, when we know that actually it's not at all them. It's about the underinvestment in social services. It's about the liberalization of economies. It's all those things which are contributing to this current situation. It's not the poor person next door.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, those are really important pathways to encouraging migrants' participation in politics and society. And of course, we're talking about the ultimate goal here, which is participation. But of course, you mentioned it as well. We need that participation to be meaningful, not just superficial, not to check boxes. But I have the feeling that sometimes participation, meaningful participation, we're hearing these words a lot and they've become a bit of buzzwords, and they might also sound quite abstract to many people, but actually, on a day to day basis, these words have such huge impacts on people's lives, on migrants' lives, in terms of their place in the society and politics. So I want to bring these words to life through your experience, knowledge, and words. Anna, maybe I can turn to you. What does meaningful participation mean to you?
To me, it means that we as migrants, that we are at eye level with the people and that we are taken seriously. Not only that our voice is heard, but that it's actually taken into consideration that yes, that person has a point. And that is something which where we are still not at yet. uh, there are good initiatives, there are good movements, there are good things happening, but it is often still the case, unfortunately, that when migrants are invited to like a event or to create like a more diverse environment, that it still is a bit of the feeling checked out, see like, oh, how is it like having a person with another culture in our rounds and so on. So that is not meaningful participation. It is at eye level, sitting at the same table, not being talked about, but being talked with and ask for advice.
That's a very good way of putting it. That superficial level, like you said, is sometimes it's for the photos, sometimes it's for the reporting. So you can say that you had these people from different cultures in the room. But
Exactly.
even then, it doesn't mean that it's going to be talking to each other at the eye level. That's a very good way of putting it. And that has not been said before on this podcast. So I'm glad we
Oh,
coined a new
okay.
term here as well. I wanted to also explore with you because you live in Finland and you work in this field in Finland. There have been some concerning trends and events in Finland as well. For example, in June this year, the government basically gave a green light for violence and pushbacks at the border. And they basically did that based on this so called instrumentalization of migration, which is referring to, states or other actors facilitating irregular migration movements into another country to destabilize the country. That's kind of the claim that's being made. Do you see any impact of what's going on at the political level and the weaponization of anti migration rhetoric in real life, in your work, and especially when it comes to the participation of migrants in political or civic life?
Definitely, yes. And I must say, since we have the new government now, the climate got like people are much more anxious. That is like a big concern, and there is much more pressure also on migrants to integrate faster. And I was lately actually thinking about we have much more participation now in our volunteer activities, which is of course like positive for us, but I am a bit worried that it's also due to the government putting a lot of pressure onto people to integrate much faster, to learn the language in like a very short time, to find a job in a very short time, which is like close to impossible, especially if you have a migrant background. So, I mean, we talk a lot in the work I do, like with the women that come to us. Like we talk a lot about, of course, discrimination, racism, like that happens in everyday life. Um, but of course, like, I mean, depending on with who you talk, there, like you get the answer like that is something that happens like since we came here. So like there's also a little bit like maybe that resignation and like that little bit losing the hope also that things could get easier.
Mm-hmm. It just, you talking about how this climate, in a way, is actually forcing people to engage more out of fear and anxiety. It just made me think how, since the Belgian national elections, which also led to the right wing and far right in certain parts of the country gaining a lot of power, suddenly made me study Flemish and Dutch like every other day, and
There
to
you go.
get my citizenship as soon as possible. So
Yes, yeah, and you can see, if I might add, like many organizations now apply for money for projects that deal with like integration into the job market, and you can clearly see it is a connection, or at least I say it is a connection with what the government is has written in their government program. Like you have to get a job after you registered here within 3 months, otherwise you have to leave the country. And that is of course like a very big threat for many people. Like you can also see like that climate change on the organizational level, and like that pushing people continuously into like working on the CV, learning the language. There is no break in that for people, just to breathe and to sit down and to say like, okay, I am in a, let's say, safe country now. I can enjoy for a bit. You are pushed like continuously to go further. And of course, your life depends on it. So it is very frightening.
What Anna describes is also a pan-European issue. So it's not just in Finland that this is happening. Indeed, it's happening across the European Union and beyond. So we've seen also in the UK and other places where indeed the rhetoric has become increasingly dehumanizing and also increasingly focused around the idea that the migrant, here we're talking about different kinds of migrants, the migrant who has a certain skin color is a risk and a threat to the European project and must be rooted out. And I think this is really the unfortunate political ideology which is underpinning all of the new kind of European approaches to migration pact, but also indeed, as Anos highlights, so the integration services and things like that, where it's really this idea that the only persons that we allow in are those which are economically useful to us, which is it's a very neocolonialist approach to humans, who are escaping their countries not because they want to necessarily, but because they must, because if they stay there, their lives are under threat as well. And I think this growth of this fortress Europe and this growth of this approach, which is really built around a security and building barbed wires at the borders, we're seeing all of that having that impact, and we're seeing the policies really reflecting that. And the sad thing about all of this is that it doesn't work. So you can put as many barbed wires as you want, but in the end, the people who are escaping being bombed at, they're going to come here regardless of what policies we put in place. And actually, I think our policy should be much more focused around how do we, as Anna says, how do we ensure that they become, psychologically fit as quickly as possible to be able to participate fully in society, because society only has to gain. And I think somehow we've lost this idea that actually migration is good for societies, that actually new blood, new fresh ideas is good for a society. And that part has been completely lost in this idea that actually migrants cost us money, which they don't necessarily do. And therefore, anything that we provide them will only be done so if they actually, work on low paid, precarious work for us. And then we will allow them in because of that. And I think there is something fundamentally wrong with that approach. And it also has been proven that it doesn't work from a policy perspective. But somehow we've forgotten that. And I think it's also because at the moment, unfortunately, the sirens of the far right, the sirens of hate, the sirens of fear are proving to be electorally extremely successful, unfortunately. And that's why we're seeing this, because politicians feel that this is the only way to ensure that they get votes for the next election. It's a very short-term perspective. And unfortunately, the victims of that end up being those which are the most marginalized, the most insecure, the ones who indeed, as Anna says, don't have the language skills, don't have the things, so actually are not attracted to the labor market in the first place. And therefore, you just create this kind of catch-22 of these people who then end up in no man's land and are expected to somehow be the model citizen.
Mm-hmm. I want to also focus a bit on what can be done on the grassroots level. How can we remove those barriers that migrants face when participating in politics and civic life, especially meaningfully?
I think most important, or like the first step, is that, and I think you, Kim, said it also, like that we educate people, especially people who are not from Europe, to make them understand how the system in each country works. When we talk about democracy, like how does the election work? Why is it important that you go and give your vote? And like, in what way is your voice influencing what is happening in your community? And we do that, for example, in our volunteer training, like the women who come to us, we give quite extent training. And among other things, we also talk about like democracy skills. And we basically start by explaining, if you are going to the votes in your at local level, it will affect like how the kindergarten is built, how the healthcare center works. So we really make people understand like what impact their voice has in their own community. I think that is the first step. And the second important thing is to build trust, which we then do by like building like a relation with the people who come to us, and to ensure that if they are participating in events with Finnish people, and we are, for example, asking them to give a speech or to state like sharing their experiences in moving to Finland or something, we have to make sure that when we send people there, that they are safe. That first of all, that we tell them, you have the right to say, I don't want to answer a question, like from which country I'm from. It can be quite intimidating, and those kind of things, so that we make sure that the people who go to such events are safe. And then I think the third point is, like we talk a lot about giving feedback here in Finland, so that you don't necessarily have to be politically active, but it's important that you report if someone is racist towards you. Like, you have to say it to the police, and it's okay to say it to the police. So we have to make sure that people understand being active and like influencing doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be politically active. And then what we do, like a big project we lately have, or like had since now 3 years, is like that so-called participatory budgeting, which is run, like we do it in cooperation with the city of Helsinki. And that is something we started in, 2018. So it's 3 times we have done that now. And the idea of that is that the city has allocated money, like this year it was 8.8 million euros, and they invite like residents in Helsinki and from the capital region to send in ideas on how to make Helsinki better with that 8.8 million euros. And of course, like the city's agenda is to reach out also to more marginalized communities because they want that everyone is participating in that, which is where neighborhood mothers come in. So when we started with the cooperation, we had neighborhood mothers who would go to their own communities, who would talk about what does participatory budgeting mean. Like they helped with creating ideas. They explained like why is it important that we send in the ideas in their own mother tongue. And thus we gave the information forward and, kind of connected the city with the marginalized communities.
That's incredible.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
That sounds really, really interesting.
Yes.
And Kim, if I can turn to you, if you have anything to add on removing those barriers, but more on the grassroots level, and maybe specific initiatives to mention.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we forget, or a lot of us have never experienced what it is, to run from your country, to ask for asylum, to spend a year, 2, 3, waiting for an answer as to whether your request will even be accepted, that you don't have papers. So if you go to the police and you don't have papers, you might get it deported. And I think it's that kind of reality that we have to realize, that the person does not have a national security number. So they might not be able to go see a doctor, or they don't have a fixed address, so they're not able to go to school. I think it's all those kinds of really practical things that we forget. And then at the same time, you then have politicians saying that you're the one who is the reason for why crime is up in the streets, or why social services can't be delivered because you're there, you exist. And I think that's the reality upon which then, like, as Anna highlighted, this is where then integration comes in, and you must integrate. And I think that's a very unfair request, but I think it's also important for us to see how unfair that is and how unrealistic that is. And then in that context, I think, what is the role of then of local authorities and local community groups, etc. I think it's to remove that burden of integration, the burden that you must be the one who needs to do everything to integrate into society, when actually I think society also has a responsibility as well. And I think, if we look at how Europe dealt with the Ukraine-Russia war and how we dealt with Ukrainian refugees, the reaction was so different from local authorities, national governments, the people, compared to what we see now with other migrants who are facing exactly the same conditions. They're facing the exact same wars, and yet we have a very different kind of reading. And I think that's where we need to kind of challenge ourselves, or challenge our neighbors, challenge each other to go, why do we have this kind of double standard when it comes to welcoming refugees? And we see that if you have a process that is clear, if you have a process which is really built around removing administrative burdens, administrative hurdles, people integrate rather quickly indeed. But if you keep on adding lots and lots of barriers, if you keep on adding lots of burdens, the longer it takes for a person to integrate, the worse it is, not just for the person and the person's well-being, it's actually worse for society as well, because these people don't actually get an opportunity to contribute. And so we at ENR indeed have been doing a lot of work also to try to kind of accompany local authorities to kind of understand what role they can play with regards to this. And I think there's a number of things that a local authority can do despite whatever is happening at the national level. And I think one of the first things which is really important is actually, first of all, identifying that this is something which the local authority wants to prioritize or wants to work on. And I think it's important for local authority to recognize this, not just from a kind of moral human perspective, but also if you want to go the utilitarian way, from a social cohesion and making sure that there is peace in their cities, having a core office which is coordinating and working in this space is really important. And then actually it goes back to this meaningful participation we were talking about earlier in the conversation, because meaningful participation is actually about enabling the people who have the lived experience to be able to shape and design the policies and the processes which are going to be implemented, and then having a say to say if the process is actually working. And I think that's, for me, the meaningful participation is at the design, at the implementation, at the evaluation. And it's not a tokenistic thing, or it's not a thing where we will invite one person from the community to be present, but it's actually realizing that, hey, we might be the ones delivering the services, but actually they are our customers. They are the ones we are servicing. They are the ones that should be telling us what we should be working on. And I think it's kind of changing that mentality, which leads to meaningful participation. And once a local authority sees that as something valuable, trust will start to be built. people will start to open up, and you can actually start developing truly evidence-based and, you know, with the participation of the communities, and that will actually have meaningful long-term transformational effect on the ability of us as societies to actually welcome new migrants, as opposed to us forcing the migrant to integrate, quote unquote.
Yes, yes, yes. Every single episode on this podcast where we talked about meaningful participation, right around this time, like third quarter of the episode gone, we come to a point where one of the guests basically breaks down how a normal, authentic, interpersonal relationship can work and should work. It's like two people, they value each other. Because of that, at the end, they trust each other and they just contribute to each other in a constructive way. And then I proceed to ask, then why is it so hard? This is like the basics of just interacting with people, but then we end up talking about it episodes on end. But moving on from that as well, I feel like this whole episode we've been mentioning concerning trends and what can be done about it. And I really want to make this podcast a place where our listeners not only can feel heard and get their experience validated, but also a place where they can leave a little bit hopeful from. And I know that people that work on these issues, like yourselves, need to find hope intentionally and actively to be able to keep going. So maybe Anne, I can start with you. What are you hopeful for in the future?
Well, I think it's a question that, like, we ask ourselves, if not weekly, then daily, or if not daily, then weekly. So I think for me, it's the people I'm surrounded by, like our women, like our volunteers who come to us, who have immense knowledge, who go through so many things that I can't even imagine. You know, they have gone through so many hardships, and still they, you know, show up and they say like, yes, we can do it. And I think I get a bit sentimental here, but I think that is what keeps me going every day, because I know, you know, even if it's just one person who comes to our activities or who is like meeting with me or with my colleagues, I know that we have a huge impact on that person's life. And I gained so much motivation and so much strength from the women that come to our events and workshops and who share their stories with us. So I think that's my hope, that it can only get better. And as long as we are not silent, as long as we are still staying strong and together, and as long as we use every little inch and every little possibility to influence, to impact, I think there's still hope left.
What about you, Kim? What gives you hope?
I think the fact that nothing is ever fixed. So, whilst this is a trend, the trends lead to counter trends. And I think the counter trend is up to us to build, in essence. And I think there's so many things that can be done. You know, the migration pact can be challenged, a new law can come, we can push for a new law, you can push for a new rethinking of policies and those types of things. And I think also sometimes, whilst we may face a wall on one side, it doesn't mean that there's a wall everywhere. So I think it's finding the places where the wall is weak or where the wall does not exist, and collaborating in slightly different ways. So building new kinds of coalitions with new actors, or potentially identifying the allies within the actors to make sure that we mitigate the current trends as much as possible. And then we use the success stories to revert the trends. And I think also, for me, I think it's about humanizing or reintroducing the humanizing aspects. So you know, championing and talking about the stories of migrants, talking about what it takes to actually get here. And I think people don't realize that it's the stories, the horrible stories that people have to go through to get to Europe. And I think we need to speak more about that. But also that once here, many migrants succeed and contribute massively to the communities that they're part of by volunteering, by becoming community leaders, by becoming politicians. People come with amazing skills and talents. It's not just we don't have just talentless migrants. We have migrants who are doctors, who are nurses, who are artists, etc., who are great cooks. So all of that, and each one person that makes it safely here is a success, and each success we need to speak about. And the more we speak about it, the more this idea that migrants and racialized people are threats becomes less tenable. And I think that's what we have to remember, that things are not fixed, counter trends will happen, and we have to continue to humanize the stories, because that's what will really reignite, in essence, the empathic ability of Europeans.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great note to end on. I really want to thank you both for sharing your knowledge, expertise, wisdom. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was my interview with Kim and Anna. Throughout this conversation, it became clear to me that anti-migrant and anti-migration sentiment in the EU isn't just leading to policy changes at both the EU and national levels, but it's also affecting migrants' day-to-day lives. Whether that's trying to learn the language of the country you live in to get your documentation sorted as soon as possible, or rushing to find a job to avoid deportation. And yes, maybe in some cases, we can see and interpret this as the current political climate is leading to more participation of migrants in society, but this is driven by insecurity, fear, and anxiety. That's not the kind of participation we need. And that's not what we mean by meaningful participation. In diverse and mobile societies, migrants, New Europeans, should be able to engage with others at the I level, like Anna said. They should be able to be heard, contribute, and participate in political decisions. So in this hostile environment, it's more important than ever that we work towards that kind of participation for migrants, New Europeans, in political and civic life. And with that, thank you for tuning in to Changing the Table, where we uncover the obstacles faced by New Europeans in society and politics. I'm your host and producer, Seden Anlar, and if you like this episode, please subscribe and spread the word. Changing the Table is available on all podcast platforms. If you want to stay updated, follow the Migration Policy Group on social media at MigPolGroup, and subscribe to the newsletter at www.migpolgroup.com. Changing the Table is produced by the New Europeans Initiative, a project of the Migration Policy Group, an independent Brussels-based think and do tank that sets the agenda on integration, migration, and anti-discrimination. Funding for the podcast is provided by the Citizens, Equality, Rights, and Values Program of the European Union. Thank you, and see you soon.